Let's start with Guterres meetings. What is the reaction of the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry, and will this have consequences for the UN Secretary-General? What is dead cannot die. I don't think we should expect any dramatic consequences for him, except for the actualization of the issue of his replacement.
Оскільки дійсно пан Гутерреш вже нагутерив на те, щоб підняти питання про можливу...
Because, indeed, Mr. Guterres has already made a point of raising the issue of a possible new UN Secretary-General. Speaking in order, several things strike me as being noteworthy here. And not just the fact that he did not go to the summit in Switzerland, but went to the BRICS. There is nothing surprising here. What would he do at a summit in Switzerland around the peace formula? He would sit and, circle the wagons, listening to proposals and watching how, say, tough UN actions are assessed. Russian aggression is the greatest security challenge of the 21st century and the greatest war of our time. The UN under Guterres' chairmanship is not part of the solution, but part of the problem. Peace Summit. In Switzerland was a response to the ineffectiveness of the UN, which failed to protect the world from the threat, stop the aggressor, and bring him to justice. The peace formula is an attempt to implement the UN Charter outside of its borders. Let me remind you that it was a year before, give or take, Ukraine proposed UN reforms to uphold the key principles of the UN Charter, but it was clear the world and the UN were not ready to acknowledge or address these issues. As a result, we left the UN premises to implement the Charter elsewhere. It is clear that for Guterres to come here, to a place where the very essence of the meeting is to recognize that he is incapacitated, would be illogical and unpleasant. But to go to Kazan is to try to justify his own existence because he just put on big rubber boots, gloves, a chemical suit, and went to do the toxic work that no one else would do for him, to meet with different shades of brown. I mean, isms, Nazisms, Rushisms, etc. And to understand them better than anyone else in the West. Then he can say, you see, I am not bending over backwards, and I am not afraid to risk my own reputation in order to try to achieve peace. The fact that this does not help to achieve peace in any way, I think Guterres himself is well aware of. But he needs to justify his existence, the existence of the UN, and thus imitate it.
Жодним чином не допомагає досягнути миру. Я думаю, що і сам Гутеррес чудово розуміє. Але йому треба виправдати існування себе, існування ООН і таким чином проімітувати це.
Plus, for all those who hold this position, it relies on an anti-American consensus among parts of the global South, often playing along with Latin American regimes as well as the Chinese. His ties to China and alignment with the Communist Party are significant. Regarding the meeting with Lukashenko, this visit may be beneficial as it allows Lukashenko to show his subjectivity, with China providing support and security against Moscow.
Лукашенкові в цьому і тримає певний рівень безпекової парасольки і парасольки суб'єктності над ним від Москви.
And the fact that Guterres met with Putin
а потім зустрівся з Лукашенком, це така собі від Пекіна демонстрація того,
and then with Lukashenko is a kind of demonstration by Beijing that Lukashenko has a level of protection from China sufficient to prevent Moscow from completely and finally eating him. Otherwise, the BRICS summit did not end with anything earth-shattering or unexpected. In fact, it was a party thrown by Xi Jinping at Putin's house. China is driving the agenda.
Їм потрібен фінансовий пояс безпеки, убезпечити себе від можливості ведення по них широкомасштабних санкцій.
To establish a financial security belt against potential sanctions, evident in the clauses for creating an alternative to the dollar and euro, which everyone has signed. Ukraine is mentioned only once, in paragraph 36, and there is nothing clear there. The Russian interpretation was not supported by the BRICS members. BRICS is not a military political alliance, and Russia has failed to create one. China has been expanding the BRICS as a financial and humanitarian alliance. And this requires as many members, participants, and a wider market as possible, More entities, knowing full well that they have completely different geopolitical, security, and other preferences, including religious, civilizational, democratic, and non-democratic regimes. They see their future and the future of the world differently, but it is important that they are in this financial system. Therefore, for Putin, the glass beads are in the form of a party where Putin welcomed everyone, shaking hands, showing the world that he is not in isolation. In reality, the party was organized by Xi Jinping, who invited everyone. Even if Putin held the summit in Sizran, China would have ensured attendance. This arrangement allowed Putin to save face while China provided him symbolic capital. Xi Jinping did not take public initiative during the summit, leaving the spotlight on Putin, but he controlled the agenda and key decisions. And everyone is well aware that they were going there for Xi Jinping's party. You can see who Xi Jinping brought to Kazan. He traveled with financiers, while Putin went with Gazprom and energy officials. This highlights that Xi aimed to address economic issues, while China focused on its own security concerns.
Газпромом, зі своїми тими, хто відповідає більше за енергоресурси, а Сі Цзіньпін проїхав з фінансистами, тобто, щоб вирішувати економічні якісь процеси.
The Russian economy relies on raw materials, and while sanctions have impacted it, the effects are not catastrophic. Russia can quickly reorient its grain and oil sales to other markets, as most buyers are less developed countries. In contrast, China's economy is a global factory with a high value-added structure based on its industrial base.
Так само, як і нафту, так само, як будь-яку сировину, можна достатньо швидко переорієнтуватися з ринків. І, зрештою, більшу частину російської сировини купували далеко не
For them, access to Western markets, the European market, the first in terms of volume, and the American market, is extremely important. Therefore, if the same sanctions were imposed on China, they would hit them disproportionately harder than Russia. They have calculated it, they have understood it, and the key throat in the ability to use such sanctions is the financial sector and the possibility of sanitary payments. We remember the long discussions about Russia's disconnection from the SWIFT system. In the case of China, such a shutdown would have enormous negative consequences because all their payments go to the West and vice versa, from the West to China. They need to establish a space for virtual conversion of sovereign currencies to avoid using the dollar or euro for payments. This is crucial for their financial and national security, particularly regarding ambitions in Taiwan and other conflicts with the West. For Russia, it's about circumventing sanctions and survival, relying on China and similar countries for transactions in sovereign currencies or through a virtual benchmark similar to the dollar. In India, Russians are unable to exchange accumulating rupees in their accounts, leaving them unable to convert or use those funds. The situation is slightly better with China and Arab countries, but it remains a challenge. Russia didn't create BRICS for this purpose. It's just one of Putin's current problems. For China, it's a key issue they're addressing now. That's why Putin brings business representatives to Beijing. He's seeking financial support. Not quite quasi. One proposed currency for BRICS was not appreciated by Elvira Nabiulina, but public reports indicate it will be developed. A new global financial system called BRICS Bridge is being established, allowing countries to make cross-border payments via digital platforms managed by their central banks. Russia has been planning this for a year, but the Kremlin previously denied any intention for a single currency or confrontation with the dollar, claiming it confronts itself. Despite acknowledging the dollar's decline, many Russians have longed for the West's stagnation, even if just for a short time. I understand why Nabiullina rejected the idea of a single currency. Even with my limited knowledge, I see it would shift dependence from Western currencies to Chinese ones, as China would likely dominate in economic size and as the issuing center for this currency.
Не будучи навіть економетристом або фінансистом, маючи достатньо обмежені знання в економетриці і в монетарній політиці, але навіть мені зрозуміло, що, по-перше, це зміна залежності від західних валют на китайську.
In other words, this is not a Russian project. It is Russia getting hooked on the Chinese needle. It is clear that they will not be particularly happy about this. First, and secondly, it does not solve any problems for Russia with the markets from which they need to obtain key goods, because they are already finding raw materials, more or less, as it is. For China, this is a solution to the problem, while for Russia, it is only a partial and not the key one. And the third important point is that such a currency will not be massive, because the key markets in terms of volume are located in the West. And you can even see how the creation of the euro in its time, although it pushed the dollar, did not replace it, even though a number of economists and public voices said that once the euro appeared, the dollar would die. The euro did not kill the dollar, and the European market is the largest market in the world in terms of volume. All key producers, all key countries trade with Europe, and they want to have access to this market. Therefore, in the case of their common currency, these are exporting countries and exporters of mainly raw materials to all countries except China. Therefore, what currency and who they will jointly negotiate for this currency is up to them. This will not play into the hands of most of these countries, but will simply accumulate this currency, which will not be interchangeable with the dollar or euro. Ultimately, it will need to be converted into cryptocurrency and funneled into the shadow sector. Currently, Russia uses this method to pay for services and covertly purchase sanctioned goods. The way they form and inflate the shadow sector and eventually return to where they started. This currency will not perform a key function for Russia, India, or other countries. It is exclusively for China. China wants to be the leader, but its reputation could be significantly shaken. The New York Times writes that the relationship between China and the DPRK is also now in question because of the alleged sending of North Korean military to Russia. According to the newspaper, China allegedly did not know about this shipment. Moreover, it leveled this image of China trying to come up with some kind of peaceful initiatives and thus opposing itself to the United States. In your opinion, does China really have this understanding that it is a kind of dove of peace? If we talk about relations between the two countries, how realistic is it that they could deteriorate at this stage? If we talk, for example, about the statements that Putin made after his meeting with Xi Jinping at the BRICS and at the press conference following the BRICS. Obviously, in the public sphere, we see that relations between Russia and China are far from perfect. They have objective moments of competition, and the field of Russia's subjectivity remains in relation to China, as there are interdependencies. They are asymmetrical. Russia is a junior partner. Their dependence on China is serious and critical for Russia. But China's dependence on Russia is also present, particularly in strategic issues, such as the Arctic, such as border stability, because in the event of war, they also need a window to the world, and many other things that Russia does have in order to bargain with China. Is this a public game, a game of bad or good policemen? Or are such differences in public manifestation a demonstration of an undisguised part of this conflict, potential that objectively exists? I, for one, am not going to say, because I see arguments for both. The article suggests that Russia, or rather China, was unaware of North Korean troops being sent to Russia, indicating rising tensions, which have surfaced before. The exchange of pleasantries took place more than once, and Russia's statements on nuclear issues caused outrage in Beijing, creating additional tension and certain steps by China to align itself with the West against Russia's nuclear warhead waving.
Зближенню позиції Заходом проти російського розмахування ядерною боєголовкою. Але поруч з тим складно собі уявити, що Пхеньян точно пішов би настільки в лоба проти...
It's hard to believe Pyongyang would act against China while China still supports Russia at BRICS. This suggests a complex situation with shared strategic interests and tensions. It's like a public game of good cop, bad cop.
З одного боку, стратегічний спільний інтерес, з другого боку, низка точок напруження і конкуренції, але і гра на публіку у вигляді розігрування паса між поганим і хорошим поліцейським, коли Китай робить вигляд, що він не знає, що робить Росія, а Росія...
Where China feigns ignorance of Russia's actions, while Russia tries to appear defiant, irritating Beijing in the process. Moscow believes that Trump could be impressed by Putin's subjectivity and consider his possible cooperation against China.
Строптивості Путіна і навіть подумати над тим, що, можливо, Путін міг би об'єднатися проти Китаю.
This idea has existed in the United States for many decades.
Багато десятиліть тому.
Just speaking about Putin's statements after the BRICS summit at his press conference, I noticed that for the first time in recent times, or at least in several months, it was Putin who said that we are ready to negotiate with Ukraine. But given the realities on the front line, he said this while the Ukrainian armed forces were already in the Kursk region and still holding their positions there.
Збройні сили України в Курській області, які там і досі тримають свої позиції, і він каже про реалії на полі бою. І плюс до цього він
He mentioned battlefield realities and claimed he received negotiation proposals with Ukraine through Turkey, which he allegedly accepted, but Zelensky supposedly rejected them the next day. What might the first two statements which followed each other indicate? Russia remains in the language of ultimatums. He needed to show the BRICS leaders that the problem lies with Ukraine, which supposedly refuses to negotiate. Russia is portrayed as strong and in control, negotiating from a position of power, while Ukraine must make concessions. There are no new arguments or changing contexts. This was just a message for the leaders, especially
бачу тут якихось нових тез або якоїсь зміни контексту. Просто перед обличчям всіх цих лідерів, особливо реагуючи на дискусію з моді, Путіну необхідно було це сказати.
As for possible negotiations with Russia, the only component that can be added is the exchange of prisoners, where, by the way, another exchange has recently taken place. And in fact, a whole series of efforts by the Ukrainian special services and the presidential office itself were aimed at intensifying these exchanges. We can see that the number of Azov people, for example, in these exchanges is growing. In other words, the track was activated right after the Kuchina operation, and the Kursk operation helped replenish the prisoner stockpile, encouraging Russia to intensify such exchanges. I hope that other actors who want to contribute to peace so very much, like the Arab countries, like the Vatican, will play into this situation and play their part in intensifying such exchanges. At least on the Ukrainian side, the Ombudsman's office and the coordination headquarters for the exchange of prisoners as well as the president's office, as far as I know, are doing everything for this. But getting back to the topic of the statements, the only track that can be added to the exchange of prisoners, to the grain corridor, and, say, parity of power in the Black Sea in terms of exports, is really the elements of an agreement on energy. This has been said by President Zelensky, and I think we have not heard the Russian side reject such ideas. This suggests that they are also considering this possibility for themselves. Let's recall the information that negotiations were held in an Arab country from which Russia withdrew, or rather suspended them but did not withdraw. It was about a possible moratorium on strikes on energy infrastructure in both directions. Now, we have reached the point where we can say that Ukraine can damage certain cities and the energy and heating sectors in Russia itself quite deeply. Once we achieve the ability to inflict significant pain on Russia, we can either discard or keep these cards on the table. Then, mutual exchanges of blows will occur, as Ukraine will not be left to freeze alone. If Russia decides to halt strikes, both sides will either freeze together or not at all.
Якоюсь організацією чи країною, а сугубо балансом сил. Якщо Росія порушує, то Україна так само стріляє від.
It can be guaranteed not by any organization or country, but purely by the balance of power. If Russia violates it, Ukraine also shoots back. It is clear that Ukraine will not be the first to violate such agreements. Just like, for example, ensuring exports through the Black Sea, Russia has started to attack Ukrainian ships and ports, and Ukraine has demonstrated that it can also stop exports from Novorossiysk and other Russian ports. When both sides have enough power, Russia may avoid disrupting our exports, enabling both to use the Black Sea, or neither will. Zelensky also stated at the Crimean platform that the victory plan would bring Russia to the summit under Ukraine's peace formula, with all points implemented. How do you envision this happening? It's hard to talk about their full implementation at the moment, but I support them, of course. President Zelensky's remarks about connecting the victory plan and peace formula were clear in his parliamentary speech, something I had anticipated. It's tiring to explain government plans from an expert perspective, as these concepts may be obvious to experts, but remain mere words to the general public, who look for accountability from those in power.
Тих, хто, власне, бере відповідальність на себе за їх реалізацію. І тут, я думаю, що ключовим, скажімо, зараз...
Here I think the key point I want to demonstrate to Ukraine is that agreements with Russia are only possible from a position of strength. Only then Russia is ready to come to the negotiating table, when they realize that the alternative is worse for them. The plan of victory is aimed at putting Ukraine in a strong position, demonstrating to Russia that it will only get worse for them. Because right now Russia has a number of reasons to believe that they can sit it out, that they can drag it out longer, that the West can break earlier, that Russia can scare them into backing down. It is important to demonstrate that no one will back down, no one will be intimidated, and that Ukraine will now be critically strengthened. Accordingly, Russia must either negotiate or Ukraine will be forced to do so by force. Ukraine is telling its partners, look, we have two options. Either diplomatically, but then we need to put pressure on Putin now to start actually sitting down at the negotiating table, or we have option two, which is force, if Russia does not agree to negotiate. Both options involve arming and strengthening Ukraine. If they are not ready to help by striking deep into Russia and closing the air, then let them invest in our self-sufficiency. Let them untie our hands to attack Russia and enforce peace, to return to the status quo of 2013. The invitation to NATO and control over resources demonstrate that there will be no bargaining over Ukrainian territories, and neither Russia nor those who believe that Russia will not lose should count on it. They will reach an agreement with Russia, since it currently controls more Ukrainian territories than Ukraine does, underscoring the issue of territories and sovereignty. Will not be subject to negotiations. Oleh, thank you very much for joining us on Eater. For our viewers, I would like to remind you that Oleg Sahakyan, a political analyst, was on the line with us.